The Fall by Albert Camus, Literary Quotes. The following video content presents and discusses literary quotes crafted to enhance your academic study, deepen literary analysis, and inspire your writing. If you're interested in Albert Camus's philosophy quotes, click the link below or explore our channel's philosophy series. Albert Camus' The Fall takes readers into the confessional monologue of Jean-Baptiste Clément, a self-proclaimed judge penitent, as he unravels his life's moral complexities. Set against the foggy backdrop of Amsterdam, the narrative blends elements of existential philosophy with a penetrating examination of guilt, hypocrisy, and human fallibility. Through his introspective confession, Clément explores themes of judgment, redemption, and the inherent duplicity of human nature, ultimately confronting the limits of personal freedom and the burden of self-awareness. This novel is not only a philosophical exploration, but also a critique of the human tendency to seek power and avoid true accountability. Quote 1. A single sentence will suffice for modern man. He fornicated and read the papers. In this quote, Camus is reflecting on the trivial and often superficial concerns of modern society. He reduces the complexity of contemporary human existence to two basic activities: physical indulgence and passive consumption of information. This critique suggests a kind of moral and intellectual bankruptcy in which deeper, more meaningful pursuits have been abandoned. Camus's use of the phrase, "a single sentence," conveys a sense of resignation, as if nothing more profound can be said about modern life. Quote 2. Haven't you noticed that our society is organized for this kind of liquidation? Here, Camus draws a metaphor between modern social structures and a methodical process of destruction. By using the term liquidation, which typically refers to the elimination of assets, he suggests that society strips away individuality and reduces people to mere cogs in a larger system. His imagery of flesh being cleaned up by tiny teeth highlights the relentless, almost invisible ways in which society erodes personal freedom and autonomy. Quote 3. The camel that provided the hair for my overcoat was probably mangy, yet my nails are manicured. This quote speaks to the inherent contradictions of human nature, where appearances and reality are often at odds. Clément, the narrator, uses this metaphor to describe his own hypocrisy, acknowledging that while he may present a polished exterior, his inner self is flawed. This duality is central to Camus's exploration of guilt, authenticity, and moral complexity. Quote 4. Do you know that in my little village, during a punitive operation, a German officer courteously asked an old woman to please choose which of her 2 sons would be shot as a hostage? This stark anecdote emphasizes the cruel absurdity of moral choices in extreme situations. By highlighting the paradox of courtesy in the context of such brutality, Camus underscores the dissonance between civility and violence. The story reflects the existential theme that life often forces impossible, senseless decisions, illustrating the indifference of the universe to human suffering. Quote 5. Have you noticed that Amsterdam's concentric canals resemble the circles of hell? Here, Camus uses the geography of Amsterdam as an extended metaphor for moral and existential descent. By likening the canals to Dante's circles of hell, he suggests that the deeper one delves into the city, and by extension, into oneself, the more one confronts the darker aspects of existence. This aligns with Camus' broader exploration of guilt, judgment, and self-awareness throughout The Fall. Quote 6. I never cross a bridge at night. It's the result of a vow. Clément's avoidance of crossing bridges at night symbolizes his fear of confronting difficult moral decisions. A bridge often represents a passage or transition, and the darkness of night amplifies the uncertainty of what lies on the other side. His vow could be seen as a coping mechanism to avoid facing the potential consequences of his actions or inactions, further reflecting the themes of guilt and self-judgment in the novel. Quote 7. But if you don't have any objection, the easiest thing would be for me to accompany you as far as the harbor. In this quote, Clemens offers to accompany the listener, a gesture that reflects his manipulative nature. While it appears as an act of kindness, it also symbolizes his desire to lead others into his own moral and existential dilemmas. The harbor, a place of departure and uncertainty, represents the unknown moral and philosophical territory he is steering his companion toward, drawing them into his confessional. Quote 8. When one has no character, one has to apply a method. This quote speaks to the idea that individuals who lack a strong moral compass or personal integrity often rely on rigid systems or routines to govern their actions. Clemens admires the methodical precision of those who carry out atrocities because they compensate for their lack of personal conviction with systematic cruelty. This reflects the broader theme of moral compromise and the hollow structures people build to justify their actions. Quote 9. Among them, at least, spitefulness is not a national institution. In this line, Clemens reflects on the differences between cultures, praising the Dutch for their lack of malice compared to other societies. His observation reveals a deeper commentary on how certain negative traits, like spite or cruelty, become ingrained in a culture almost institutionalized. It also serves as a contrast to his own cynicism and distrust of human nature, which he projects onto the broader world. Quote 10. Our society is organized for this kind of liquidation. This quote repeats the earlier observation, but with even more clarity. Camus critiques the way society is structured to eliminate individuality, autonomy, and morality. The use of liquidation conveys a sense of systematic destruction, highlighting the way social institutions work and conformity strip people down until nothing unique or meaningful remains. Quote 11. I never had to learn how to live. In that regard, I already knew everything at birth. This quote reflects Clemens's arrogance and his sense of superiority over others. He believes he has an innate understanding of life and its complexities, positioning himself above those who struggle with self-awareness and moral dilemmas. This self-perception sets the stage for the eventual unraveling of his character, as the narrative explores the consequences of such hubris and the false sense of moral high ground he holds. Quote 12. How many crimes committed merely because their authors could not endure being wrong? Camus highlights the destructive power of pride and the lengths to which individuals will go to preserve their self-image. This quote underscores a central theme of The Fall, the human tendency to commit moral transgressions out of an inability to accept personal failure or guilt. Clemens uses this reflection to justify his own behavior, suggesting that the fear of being wrong or vulnerable is a driving force behind many of society's ills. Quote 13. I took pleasure in life and in my own excellence. Here, Clemens's narcissism is evident as he takes satisfaction not just from his success, but from the perceived moral superiority that comes with it. He is not just living life, but reveling in his achievements and virtues, convinced that his actions place him above others. However, this self-satisfaction is later shown to be hollow, as the narrative reveals his deeper insecurities and the flaws in his worldview. Quote 14. I was not bored because I was riding on the crest of the wave. This quote encapsulates Clemens's sense of invincibility and momentum in his life. He feels that he is constantly in control, moving effortlessly through life's challenges without ever facing boredom or dissatisfaction. The image of riding the wave suggests a kind of exhilarating success that blinds him to the undercurrents of guilt and doubt that will eventually consume him. Quote 15. I felt rising within me a vast feeling of power, and, I don't know how to express it, of completion, which cheered my heart. In this moment, Clemens experiences a sense of total satisfaction and fulfillment, as though he has reached a pinnacle of success or self-realization. The feeling of completion suggests that he believes he has achieved all that is necessary in life. Yet this is a fleeting emotion that soon gives way to doubt and self-reflection, marking the beginning of his existential crisis. Quote 16. I was altogether in harmony with life, fitting into it from top to bottom without rejecting any of its ironies, its grandeur, or its servitude. This quote reflects Clemens's belief in his perfect integration with the world around him. He sees himself as someone who accepts both the beauty and the hardships of life without complaint. However, as the story progresses, it becomes clear that this harmony is superficial, masking deeper internal conflicts and a profound sense of guilt that he struggles to confront. Quote 17. Each joy made me desire another. I went from festivity to festivity. Clemens describes a cycle of constant desire and dissatisfaction, where each moment of joy is fleeting and only leads to a craving for more. This endless pursuit of pleasure reflects the existential theme of the fall, where happiness is transient and ultimately unfulfilling. The inability to find lasting contentment drives Clemens into a deeper sense of despair and questioning. Quote 18. I managed to love simultaneously, and this is not easy. Women and justice. In this quote, Clemens boasts about his ability to balance two seemingly incompatible aspects of life: romantic desire and a sense of moral righteousness. This balance is portrayed as an achievement, further feeding his ego. However, the narrative later reveals that this perceived harmony is a facade, as Clemens's relationships and his sense of justice are both deeply flawed and self-serving. Quote 19. Have you noticed that death alone awakens our feelings? Camus here reflects on the idea that people often only experience genuine emotion or reflection in the face of death. This insight highlights the superficiality of human relationships and the way we take life for granted until it is threatened. For Clemens, this realization is part of his broader existential crisis, as he grapples with the emptiness of his past actions and the fleeting nature of life. Quote 20. I never missed a day. He died satisfied with me, holding both my hands. This quote speaks to Clemens's need for validation and the role he plays in others' lives, particularly at significant moments like death. He ensures that he is present when it matters most, not out of genuine care, but because it boosts his self-image and sense of moral superiority. This self-serving approach to relationships ultimately reveals the hollowness of his actions and his deep-seated guilt. Quote 21. I ceased to walk along the Paris quays. When I would ride along them in a car or bus, a sort of silence would descend on me. Clemens's avoidance of the Paris quays symbolizes his internal struggle and guilt, following the mysterious laugh he heard on the Pont des Arts. The quays, a place where he once walked freely, now evoke a silence that reflects his discomfort and unease. His detachment from this familiar space signals the beginning of his existential crisis, as he starts to confront the unsettling truths about himself that he has long suppressed. Quote 22. Every man needs slaves, as he needs fresh air. In this bold statement, Clemens reveals his belief that dominance and control are inherent aspects of human nature. He argues that everyone, even the lowest in society, seeks someone to command, whether it be a wife, a child, or even a dog. This view reflects Camus' exploration of power dynamics and the darker aspects of human relationships, where individuals often seek to assert their superiority over others in subtle or overt ways. Quote 23. Power, on the other hand, settles everything. Clemens acknowledges the role of power in silencing debate and enforcing control. In this quote, he critiques the modern shift from dialogue to dominance, where force and authority have replaced reason and discussion. His reflection underscores a broader societal trend towards coercion and submission, rather than mutual understanding, reflecting a deep cynicism about the state of human interaction and governance. Quote 24. I is the refrain of my whole life. Here, Clements admits his narcissism and self-obsession. The repeated I illustrates his egocentric worldview, where everything revolves around his own experiences and desires. This confession marks a moment of self-awareness, as he begins to recognize the emptiness and isolation that come from living a life centered entirely on himself. His repeated use of I exposes the shallowness of his relationships and his detachment from others. Quote 25. All those books barely read, those friends barely loved, those cities barely visited, those women barely possessed. In this reflection, Clements laments the superficiality of his life experiences. Despite engaging in numerous activities and relationships, he realizes that he has never fully committed to any of them. His life has been marked by a kind of detachment, where he merely skims the surface of experiences without truly immersing himself. This realization contributes to his growing sense of dissatisfaction and disillusionment with his existence. Quote 26. I always succeeded with women, and without much effort. Clements's reflection on his success with women highlights his manipulative nature and his shallow approach to relationships. He views women as conquests, easily won and discarded, and admits that he never truly loved any of them. His ability to charm and seduce without genuine emotional involvement reveals his inability to form deep, meaningful connections, further emphasizing his isolation and emotional emptiness. Quote 27. My emotional impulses always turn toward me. My feelings of pity concern me. In this quote, Clements reveals his self-centeredness even in moments of supposed empathy or pity. His emotional responses are not directed toward others, but rather toward himself, highlighting his inability to truly care for anyone but himself. This admission underscores the theme of selfishness that runs throughout The Fall, as Clements confronts the ways in which his actions have been motivated by self-interest rather than genuine concern for others. Quote 28. The act of love, for instance, is a confession. Clements sees love as a moment of vulnerability, where one's true nature is revealed. In the act of love, he argues, people expose their selfishness, vanity, or generosity. This perspective reflects Clements's belief that all human interactions, even those as intimate as love, are ultimately driven by self-interest and ego. His view of love as a confession aligns with his broader existential struggle to understand his own motivations and the nature of his relationships. Quote 29. I kept all my affections within reach, to make use of them when I wanted. Clements admits that he maintained control over his relationships, ensuring that others were always available to him whenever he desired. His need to dominate and manipulate others, keeping them at his disposal, reflects his deeper insecurities and fear of losing control. This admission reveals the power dynamics at play in his relationships, where he views affection as something to be wielded and managed rather than freely given. Quote 30. For me to live happily, it was essential for the creatures I chose not to live at all. This chilling confession highlights the extent of Clements's desire for control. He admits that his happiness depends on the suppression of others' independence and freedom. He wants those in his life to exist solely for his benefit, living only when he calls upon them. This statement encapsulates Clements's deep-seated selfishness and his inability to form genuine reciprocal relationships, as he views others merely as tools for his own satisfaction. Quote 31. I was already 50 yards away when I heard the sound, which, despite the distance, seemed dreadfully loud in the midnight silence, of a body striking the water. This quote reveals a key moment in Clements's life, where his inaction leads to profound guilt. The sound of the woman's body hitting the water echoes his inner paralysis as he chooses not to turn back or help. This event marks the beginning of his moral decline, as he realizes that his perceived righteousness is fragile, and that he is not the heroic figure he once believed himself to be. Quote 32. No human beings above all, no human beings. You and I alone, facing the planet at last deserted. Clemence's desire for isolation from humanity reflects his growing disillusionment with society and himself. His wish to be alone in a desolate landscape symbolizes his internal emptiness and the futility of human connection. This scene captures his existential crisis, where he feels detached from the world and the people around him, yearning for a sense of peace that remains elusive. Quote 33. Men are never convinced of your reasons, of your sincerity, of the seriousness of your sufferings, except by your death. Here, Clemence touches on the human tendency to doubt others' pain or sincerity unless it is proven through extreme acts like death. He laments the fact that, while alive, one's suffering is always questioned, and it is only through death that people take someone's anguish seriously. This reflects his deep cynicism and frustration with the superficial judgments of society, as well as his own internal struggle with validation and guilt. Quote 34. The prosecution of others, on the contrary, went on constantly in my heart. Clemence admits that, while he was quick to forget his own faults, he was relentless in judging others. This confession reveals his hypocrisy and his tendency to deflect self-criticism by focusing on the flaws of those around him. His constant prosecution of others is a defense mechanism that allows him to avoid facing his own guilt and shortcomings, highlighting the theme of judgment that runs throughout the fall. Quote 35. Happy and judged, or absolved and wretched. This quote encapsulates the central dilemma of Clemence's philosophy: the choice between being happy while under constant scrutiny or being miserable but free from judgment. He realizes that one cannot escape the judgment of others without sacrificing personal happiness, reflecting the broader existential themes of freedom, guilt, and the human desire for approval. His own life is a balancing act between these conflicting desires. Quote 36. We are all exceptional cases. We all want to appeal against something. Clemence points to the universal human desire to be seen as unique and innocent, even in the face of wrongdoing. Everyone believes that their circumstances are special and that they deserve understanding or forgiveness. This quote underscores the irony of the human condition. While people are quick to judge others, they always seek to excuse themselves, clinging to the notion of their own exceptionalism. Quote 37. It's a matter of dodging judgment. In this brief but powerful statement, Clemence sums up his primary motivation: avoiding the judgment of others. His entire philosophy revolves around the fear of being judged and the lengths to which he will go to evade it. This desire to escape judgment is a driving force in his actions and decisions, revealing his deep insecurity and the existential weight of guilt that haunts him throughout the novel. Quote 38. One must accuse oneself in a certain way, which it took me considerable time to perfect. Clemence recognizes that self-accusation, if done properly, can serve as a defense mechanism against external judgment. By confessing his faults in a controlled manner, he seeks to disarm his critics and maintain a sense of control over his image. This calculated approach to guilt reflects his ongoing struggle with authenticity and the complex relationship between confession and absolution in the human psyche. Quote 39. I used to knock off a considerable pile of work through successive periods of idleness. This quote highlights Clemence's contradictory nature. While he presents himself as hard-working and productive, his achievements are often the result of sporadic effort rather than sustained dedication. His admission of laziness juxtaposed with his success reflects the theme of appearances versus reality, as he maintains a facade of competence while secretly feeling detached and indifferent to his responsibilities. Quote 40. I have never been really able to believe that human affairs were serious matters. Clements confesses his inability to take life seriously, viewing human efforts and convictions as mere games. This detachment from the gravity of life's concerns contributes to his existential crisis, as he struggles to find meaning in a world that appears trivial and absurd. His lack of belief in the seriousness of human affairs underscores his isolation and alienation from society, deepening his sense of guilt and purposelessness. Quote 41. With its flat shores, lost in the fog, there's no saying where it begins or ends. So we are steaming along without any landmark. We can't gauge our speed. We are making progress, and yet nothing is changing. In this passage, Clements reflects on the disorienting nature of the journey, both literally and metaphorically. The fog and lack of landmarks symbolize his existential confusion, where progress in life feels aimless, and despite moving forward, nothing seems to truly change. This sense of drifting mirrors Clements's moral and philosophical crisis, where clarity and direction are elusive, leaving him stuck in a state of stasis. Quote 42. I realized likewise that it would continue to await me on seas and rivers, everywhere, in short, where lies the bitter water of my baptism. Clements acknowledges that the guilt he carries from his past actions, particularly from the moment he failed to save the woman who drowned, will follow him wherever he goes. The bitter water of my baptism symbolizes this inescapable guilt, marking him as forever tainted by his inability to act. His realization that the haunting cry of the woman is omnipresent reflects his internal torment, as he can never outrun the consequences of his moral failings. Quote 43. One mustn't blame everything exclusively on the Christians. The others are involved too. Wherefore, since we are all judges, we are all guilty before one another, all Christs in our mean manner, one by one crucified, always without knowing. Here, Clements expands his criticism beyond specific religious or moral groups to humanity as a whole. He argues that everyone is both a judge and guilty, participating in a cycle of judgment and condemnation. By comparing all individuals to Christ, who was crucified without fully understanding his fate, Clements suggests that humans, too, are constantly judged and condemned without full awareness of their guilt. This reflects the existential theme of collective responsibility and the shared burden of human fallibility. Quote 44. But the keenest of human torments is to be judged without a law. Yet we are in that torment. Clements identifies the greatest human suffering as being judged in the absence of any clear moral or legal framework. In such a situation, there is no standard by which one can be exonerated or found guilty, leaving individuals in a perpetual state of uncertainty and fear. This reflects Clements's personal anguish, as he grapples with his own guilt and the impossibility of finding redemption in a world without fixed moral boundaries. Quote 45. The sole benefit of that experience, when I had given up my nocturnal exploits, was that life became less painful for me. The fatigue that was gnawing at my body had simultaneously cauterized many raw spots in me. In this moment, Clements reflects on the physical and emotional toll of his excessive lifestyle. While his indulgence in debauchery initially brought him some relief from his existential pain, it ultimately left him drained and numb. The raw spots that were once sensitive are now cauterized, suggesting that he has become desensitized to both pleasure and suffering. This numbness, however, comes at the cost of vitality and meaning in his life. Quote 46. For it cannot be said there is no more pity. No, good Lord, we never stop talking of it. Simply, no one is ever acquitted anymore. Clements comments on the modern world's obsession with pity and compassion while noting the irony that, despite all the talk, true forgiveness is never granted. People may speak of pity, but they continue to judge and condemn, offering no real absolution. This reflects the central theme of the fall, the inescapable nature of judgment and the impossibility of redemption in a world where everyone is guilty and no one is truly forgiven. Quote 47. At a certain degree of lucid intoxication, lying late at night between two prostitutes and drained of all desire, hope ceases to be a torture, you see. The mind dominates the whole past, and the pain of living is over forever. Clemens describes how, in moments of intoxication and debauchery, he reaches a state where his mind is free from the burdens of hope and the pain of existence. In these fleeting moments, he feels liberated from the existential torment that usually plagues him. However, this relief is temporary and artificial, as it is achieved through self-destruction and escape, rather than through genuine understanding or resolution. Quote 48. I merely wanted to tell you the advantage I derived from those months of orgy. I lived in a sort of fog, in which the laughter became so muffled that eventually I ceased to notice it. Clemens reflects on how his indulgence in excess numbed him to the mocking laughter that once tormented him. The fog of his debauchery acts as a shield, dulling his awareness of judgment and guilt. However, this numbness also distances him from reality and from any possibility of true self-awareness or redemption, trapping him in a cycle of avoidance and superficial relief. Quote 49. I had to submit and admit my guilt. I had to live in the little ease. In this confession, Clemens acknowledges that he can no longer avoid his guilt and must face the consequences of his actions. The little ease refers to a medieval dungeon where prisoners were forced to live in uncomfortable, confined conditions. For Clemens, this represents his internal prison, where he is constantly reminded of his guilt and unable to find peace or escape. This marks a turning point in his journey toward self-awareness and acceptance of his flawed nature. Quote 50. But what do I care? Don't lies eventually lead to the truth? And don't all my stories, true or false, tend toward the same conclusion? Clemens reflects on the nature of truth and falsehood, suggesting that the distinction between them is ultimately irrelevant if both lead to the same understanding. He implies that his stories, whether grounded in reality or not, reveal a deeper truth about himself and the human condition. This blurring of fact and fiction highlights his existential crisis, where the boundaries between authenticity and deception become indistinct. Quote 51. Truth, like light, blinds. Falsehood, on the contrary, is a beautiful twilight that enhances every object. In this statement, Clemens romanticizes deception, arguing that lies offer a more appealing, softer version of reality than the harsh, blinding truth. For him, truth can be overwhelming, while falsehood creates a space where reality is more manageable and aesthetically pleasing. This perspective reflects his retreat into illusion and his discomfort with confronting the raw truths of his own life and actions. Quote 52. I was tempted by the resistance, about which people were beginning to talk just about the time I discovered that I was patriotic. Clemens cynically admits that his sense of patriotism was sparked not by genuine loyalty or conviction, but by a moment of personal resentment. His so-called patriotism arises not from an internal moral compass, but from external circumstances, revealing his opportunistic nature. This confession further exposes his lack of commitment to any higher ideals, illustrating the theme of moral ambiguity in The Fall. Quote 53. One must forgive the Pope. To begin with, he needs it more than anyone else. This quote underscores Clemens's evolving view on authority and guilt. He suggests that figures of authority, like the Pope, are in desperate need of forgiveness, perhaps even more so than ordinary individuals. By extending this idea, Clemens comments on the heavy burden carried by those in power, who, in their roles as leaders, accumulate more guilt and responsibility, making their need for absolution even greater. Quote 54. The essential is being able to permit oneself everything, even if, from time to time, one has to profess vociferously one's own infamy. Clemens embraces a philosophy of total freedom, where the key to happiness lies in allowing oneself to indulge in all desires without restraint. However, he acknowledges that, to maintain this freedom, one must occasionally admit to their wrongdoings, if only to relieve the pressure of judgment. This duality of indulgence and confession reflects his manipulation of guilt and his desire to escape the consequences of his actions. Quote 55. For anyone who is alone, without God and without a master, the weight of days is dreadful. Camus expresses the existential loneliness that comes with the absence of higher guidance or authority. Without the structure provided by religion or a moral code, life becomes an overwhelming burden. This sentiment speaks to the core existential themes in The Fall, where the absence of absolutes leaves individuals grappling with meaninglessness and the heaviness of personal freedom and responsibility. Quote 56. Don't wait for the last judgment. It takes place every day. Camus argues that judgment is not a singular event that occurs at the end of life, but is a constant process that unfolds daily. People are judged by others and themselves in every action and decision they make. This insight captures the ongoing nature of guilt and moral scrutiny that defines human existence in the world of the fall, where no one can escape the weight of judgment. Quote 57. The more I accuse myself, the more I have a right to judge you. In this quote, Camus reveals the manipulative nature of his self-confessions. By accusing himself first, he feels that he gains the moral authority to judge others. This tactic allows him to avoid being judged by placing himself above those around him, creating a paradox where his self-criticism becomes a tool for asserting control over others. Quote 58. I discovered that while waiting for the masters with their rods, we should, like Copernicus, reverse the reasoning to win out. Camus reflects on his shift in strategy, drawing an analogy to Copernicus. Rather than waiting passively for external judgment, he decides to take control by condemning himself, thus reversing the traditional power dynamic. By embracing his guilt and positioning himself as a penitent, he gains the ability to judge others, flipping the script on the relationship between guilt and authority. Quote 59. I pity without absolving. I understand without forgiving. And above all, I feel at last that I am being adored. Camus has reached a point where he feels superior in his role as a judge penitent. He offers understanding but refuses to forgive, placing himself in a godlike position where he can command admiration without granting absolution. This reflects his ultimate desire for power and control, even in the realm of moral and existential judgment, and highlights the corrupting influence of his need to dominate others. The Fall revolves around the existential struggles of Jean-Baptiste Camus, a former Parisian lawyer who grapples with guilt, judgment, and the human tendency towards self-deception. Through his confessions, Camus reflects on the futility of distinguishing between truth and falsehood, suggesting that both lead to the same conclusions about human nature. His narcissism and manipulation of guilt are evident as he admits to using self-criticism as a way to judge others. Themes of moral ambiguity emerge as Camus explores the burdens of authority, the need for forgiveness, and the inescapability of daily judgment. His existential crisis is marked by a longing for freedom and a simultaneous fear of it, as he ultimately resigns himself to a philosophy where indulgence and confession coexist. Camus finds power in his role as a judge penitent, offering understanding without forgiveness, embodying the corrupting desire for control in a world without absolutes.
Curious to dive into the mind of Albert Camus? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of The Fall in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.